Welcome to Fun and Games Side Quests. Every episode is a different host sharing a video game they love and why they love it.
Hey everyone, I'm Case Aiken. Now, I'm trying to squeeze this episode of Fun and Games Side Quest in as kind of a cross promo right now. So you may all know me as the host of Men of Steel and Another Pass. And recently, Men of Steel, which is a Superman and Superman adjacent podcast, did a crossover with Fun and Games where Matt on their Twitch channel streamed the game while we were all on a voice chat together, myself, J. Mike Folson, my co-host on Men of Steel, as well as Matt and Jeff from Fun and Games, all just chatting about the game. And it's an infamously hard Super Nintendo game and then later a Sega Genesis port that features Superman. It's surprising that it's so difficult, and so it's not uncommon for people just to play the game with cheats because you're Superman. You're supposed to be invincible. Well, it was a lot of fun, and it gave me an opportunity to first replay the game before the stream and then also just watch and comment on it from a third-party perspective. And I want to say it's a game that I rather like. I don't think it's a game that was worth it at the time. It wasn't a game that was worth paying the full price of a cartridge, $50 or $60 in the moment. It was a tie-in video game. It was a video game that was released in the wake of the big event in comics, which was the death and return of Superman, modeled after a Final Fight game, modeled after a Double Dragon game, modeled after an X-Men style game. And it was the beat 'em up format that was so popular at the time. It was a really natural way to convert particularly comic fiction, but any kind of violence heavy genre was fair game for video games in the moment, and often were converted in some format into a 3/4 overhead beat 'em up, a Final Fight clone, if you will. For example, Aliens vs. Predator was adapted by 2 different studios for that same format. Once for the Super Nintendo, I forget who did that one, and then Capcom did it for the arcade, and that one is fantastic. Games like Captain America and the Avengers were popular at the time. Games like Maximum Carnage with Spider-Man was extremely popular, and its inferior, although I have a soft spot for it, sequel, which is Venom Separation Anxiety. There were a lot of video games at the time that were released in this format because it was really easy to get big sprites on there with good pixel art and really simple mechanics. And as a result, there are the ones that people really remember to this day. Games like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 4, games like Streets of Rage 2, games, the later updates like Capcom's Dungeons and Dragons game are usually considered like high watermarks for it. And then there's the more recent attempts, things like Castle Crashers, which have updated the format, or the retro style games like Streets of Rage 4. The genre is a really interesting one because the narrative is just get to the end of the alley and beat things up. It's such a basic story concept that games like Battletoads was designed as a parody of. But at the same time, it's pretty true to certain genres. When on Men of Steel, we talked about the death and return of Superman, we talked about how the fight with Doomsday feels like a fighting game, which is an offshoot of this genre. Final Fight and Street Fighter 2 are really related. But also, we talked about how the first comic with the 90s Superboy felt like one of these levels. He's literally dropped at the end of an alley and has to fight his way through a horde of criminals, ultimately confronting their main boss with death traps along the way. It's a genre that can tell a very specific type of story, and as a result, you can do more narrative things. And that's kind of the cool thing about the death and return of Superman. It honestly should be multiplayer, but by being a really focused single player game, and it's a small one in terms of storage. I think it's only about 2 megs. We actively looked it up during the stream and couldn't determine for certain how big it was, but it's a pretty small game. And the fact that it was put on 2 different platforms indicates that they weren't really pulling out all the stops to squeeze every little bit onto the cartridge. It's not a scenario like a Castle of Illusions where like you can't get over how small of a game the storage is for how complex a game and how fun and detailed and enjoyable a game the actual final product is. This is not that, but it is a pretty game. And that's actually kind of cool, especially when you take into perspective that it can be experienced now as it was then, because when I was a kid and I rented this game, I put in the cheats and it was really fun just to explore the story of the death and return of Superman in a visually appealing way that has some kind of gameplay mechanic. And I think that's a really cool experience that people take for granted now. Adapting a story, particularly one that at the time was not easy to gain access to after the fact, is a really valuable thing. The Death and Return of Superman was one of the first trade paperbacks that I ever purchased, but I purchased it after this game had come out, and trade paperbacks were a novel concept at the time. For comics especially, it wasn't weird that if you hadn't managed to collect all of the issues as they were coming out, that you had only heard allusions to what the actual stories were. And for me, as a budding comic book fan, particularly a fan coming from Marvel, so I was well versed with the concept of comics and particularly the Marvel style of how comics should work, coming over to DC, which had an extremely rich continuity that had been warped by the Crisis on Infinite Earths. And so there was a disconnect between what pop culture understood about characters and what the current status quo officially was. This was a really good way to find out the basic beats of the story. In the game, you play as Superman. In fact, you play as 5 Supermen. You go through this entire story, first dealing with the previous issues of specifically Superman, the Man of Steel, where Doomsday is introduced but doesn't actually directly confront anyone because he's just breaking out of a tomb that he has been buried inside of. And so you follow Superman as he deals with a threat to Metropolis, in this case, a Morlock-style underworld organization, which is a mix of mutants, specifically mutant humans, as well as aliens that have taken refuge under the streets of Metropolis. And these are extremely good representations of those characters. We see them a lot, particularly in that initial story arc leading into the introduction of Doomsday, and then in a story that is omitted from this video game because it actually doesn't feature Superman, which is the World Without Superman arc that occurs in between the Death and Return of Superman. And we get great representations of a lot of these like terrorist characters. Like there's like Rambo, who is this blue goat man character. And he's wonderfully represented from the John Bogdanov and Tom Grummett artwork that he is derived from. It's a fantastic representation of the story. We get Superman's battle with Doomsday, albeit the levels are terribly designed and weird, and the streets just run into buildings, and none of it makes sense. And Doomsday looks okay, but not actually as good as the first level boss, Closter, who just happens to be a dude who looks a lot like Doomsday, and somehow the sprite is better designed. But then, after Superman is dead, you get cutscenes illustrating what happened in the wake of his death, ultimately leading up to 4 imposters showing up, or really 2.5 plus 1, because you've got multiple characters. You've got the last son of Krypton, also called the Eradicator, and in this game they make no bones about the fact that it is the Eradicator, who is a Kryptonian intelligence who ultimately is revealed to be responsible for the regenerating of Superman, but in fact is not Superman and kind of a Superman villain. Specifically, here's a Krypton intelligence trying to make good. Honestly, later, the Superman animated series would make Brainiac a character who is very much like this. Instead of being Coluan, he becomes a Kryptonian intelligence. It's that kind of character being put in this situation. Then you've got the cyborg Superman, who is presented as being Superman's body resurrected. And that character is ultimately revealed to be a villain. But at the beginning, you play as him as if he is the actual Superman, and appears to be Superman most to everyone out there. You've got Superboy, who claims to be a clone of Superman, and that's mostly correct, but he never actually is pretending to be Superman per se. He's not pretending to be the reincarnated Superman. He's just pretending to be the continuation of that line. Superman 2, effectively. And I find that admirable. It's funny because in the 90s, they weren't allowed to do more Kryptonians, and so they didn't do a true clone. He's actually technically human, but that would get retconned so that he'd be Lex Luthor Superman hybrid. But at the time, he was designed to be a human who emulated the force field that Superman created, and that allowed for tactile telekinesis, which creates this fun scenario where his powers are actually like more fun than Superman's should be. Like he's able to lift things up in like comical ways that work because he's not really using super strength. Like the weight of an object isn't pushing on it. It's rather him lifting it up mentally. And then you have Steel, and Steel is never pretending to be Superman. He's always asserting that he is a guy in armor trying to live up to Superman. And you know what? That's fine. It's totally fine. In the comics, there's this idea that like he has the soul of Superman, and that's not ever really the thing, and you don't really believe that, and it's fine. He's a lot of fun too. So you get to play as all 4 of these characters. First the Cyborg, then the Eradicator, then Superboy, and ultimately Steel. You also get to fight against a lot of these characters. Steel specifically fights the Eradicator. He's the boss of that level when you're playing as the Eradicator. And then later you have to fight the Cyborg. And ultimately, when Superman comes back, you have to play him, and eventually we'll have to fight the Cyborg. One thing that kind of sucks is that you get to play as mulleted Superman, so it's the same Superman sprite but with a head swap, but you don't get to play as the black suit Superman, and that kind of sucks, but it makes sense because he's not as powerful as the others. He's like deliberately like depowered at that point. But it sucks because that sprite exists, and it's one of those points where you're like, oh, this could have been a 2-player level, but they didn't do it that way, and it would have been nice. But still, it's a fun game, and it really covers the story, and you get to play as a bunch of the different characters. Levels have different designs. There's a lot of levels that are just like beat 'em up levels, but there's plenty of levels where it's either shooters, which are unsophisticated but still at least a good break, and then there are levels where you're flying around, and it's not a shooter format so much as a trap avoidance / puzzle solving level, and those are really cool. Like I'm making that sound more sophisticated than they are. They're all very simple, but it is a fun game mechanic for expressing the story. The only thing that sucks is that you don't get very many lives, and you don't get very many super moves, and every character has some kind of ranged attack, but it is mostly a stun and not actually damage. You can, quote unquote, get good, but it's not actually that rewarding to do so. You're just going to sort of figure out the cheapest moves that you can do to win these fights, and that's fine. But honestly, I'm not recommending anyone actually just play the game to win legitimately. I'm saying play the game as Superman. You get a game that has really beautiful level design. There are several levels that are just like gorgeous to look at the backgrounds. There are unique character sprites for all of the different Supermen. They all have unique animations, which is really cool. Obviously, Steel has his hammer, and so he actually gets the biggest hitbox. Like he has the biggest reach on all of his attacks. But all of the characters have slightly different stats, and that's really interesting and makes it more disappointing that you can't play as them simultaneously, and you can't get actually like a feel for any of that really beyond just like the individual levels. But they all have cool moves. A lot of them have cool like throws. It's a really good game to look at. And so what I guess I'm saying is that it's a fun way to experience the story, the death, and ultimately the return of Superman. And it gives you a game mechanism by which to engage with while taking in that story. And that's actually really good. The pixel art is really good. The cutscene, and it's the kind of stock, here's a still image kind of situation with text, looks really good. There are several shots that are taken straight from the comics, and they look fantastic. In fact, all of the character profile pictures are the covers of the respective first issue of the Reign of Superman arc, which are for the characters in play. And they look great. It looks fantastic. It's a really fun way to take in that story. And like I said, like it just, the art is good. The music's actually pretty good. It's fun enough. Like it's hard and like it's unfair. And if you just have infinite lives, you'll thank me. I ultimately, like, you'll still get knocked down quite a bit, but you will get up again, and ain't nobody going to keep you down. And that's the way to experience the story, because you are actively playing the part of Superman, and it is a story that is foretold. You losing is not going to change what ultimately happened in the comics, so might as well enjoy the ride. And it's a perfectly fine ride, and you should play that however you can, because it's a licensed game, and unfortunately that means it is difficult to get all the people involved on board with re-releasing it now. Sunsoft is the studio that actually published it, but it was developed by Blizzard. Yes, that Blizzard, World of Warcraft Blizzard. And obviously it is a DC property. And that means a lot of people have to be involved in saying it's okay to put this on Switch Online or whatever service you are talking about. But there are ways to play it, and I would encourage you to play it however you can. Be that going to a convention and finding a used copy, or some other means, however you can. It's a good time. However you can do it, I'm pretty sure you will enjoy yourself for the 2 hours that it takes. Anyway, if you don't have time to just play it, I would encourage you to check out the stream that we put up on the Fun and Games YouTube channel. It's a really good time. We had a great conversation. We talked a lot about the individual characters, the art, the story, just the science of Superman, like lots of fun conversation there. And you should also check out the Men of Steel podcast, where we did an episode actually discussing our stream of the game. And it's a great conversation between the four of us. Matt and Jeff are fantastic. If you're subscribed to this channel, you know that. J Mike and I think we're pretty cool. You should check us out too. So like I said, check out the Fun and Games YouTube stream, check out Men of Steel podcast, all of that you can find links to at certainpov.com, where you can find my other show, Another Pass. Lots of great stuff. I encourage you to check it out. But until next time, happy gaming.
Hey.
Oh, hey, Jeff.
What's going on, guys?
Oh, talking about Superman.
Oh, cool. I could talk about Superman.
I could talk some more about Superman.
We know.
I'll bet a few people would want to get in on this.
I'm down.
You know it.
That sounds like fun. I'll do it.
Cool, let's do it. We can call the show Men of Steel.
And you can find it at certainpov.com.
Or wherever you get your podcasts.
Yay.
Hello, wonderful listener. Pat Edwards here, co-host of the Let's Rewatch podcast on this very network. For those of you who don't know me, I'm an author and a game designer. Specifically, I work in the tabletop role-playing gaming industry. Well, I recently co-founded a production studio called Storyteller's Forge. Our first big book launch has arrived. The Black Ballad is a brutal and bloody TTRPG adventure that answers the question, what happens when the heroes die? Easily adaptable to multiple gaming systems, including 5th edition D&D, The Black Ballad is the perfect campaign to start after a total party kill. We are immensely proud of this epic tome and have assembled a stellar team of collaborators. The Black Ballad features a soundtrack by Diamorte, downloadable NPC audio snippets recorded by Carlos Ferro from Gears of War and Assassin's Creed, and some truly gorgeous illustrations spearheaded by our art director James Masingo from Borderlands 2 and Shadowrun. Our crowdfunding campaign goes live March 7th on BackerKit, and I would be grateful beyond measure if you would consider ordering a copy of The Black Ballad today.
CPOV. CertainPOV.com.